My mother-in-law says I'm tearing the family apart, but she dictates every aspect of our lives, from how we run our marriage to what happens behind closed doors. When I first met Luke, I thought I had found my forever. He wasn't just handsome, he was the kind of person who made the world feel softer, kinder, and more bearable. We met at a mutual friend's wedding, where he caught me struggling to carry an overloaded plate of hors d'oeuvres. "Careful," he said with a laugh, staying my plate before it tipped. "It looks like you're planning to feed the whole table." Embarrassed but charmed, I stammered something incoherent, and he laughed again. That laugh, deep, warm, and genuine, was the first thing I fell in love with. By the end of the night, we were inseparable, exchanging numbers and sharing our first kiss under the string lights that decorated the venue's garden. Luke was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner: caring, attentive, and endlessly patient. He listened when I talked about my dreams, supported me through my insecurities, and made me feel like the most important person in the world. But Luke came with one challenge I hadn't anticipated. His mother, Margaret. When Luke introduced me to Margaret, I knew immediately that she was intense. She was polite at first, greeting me with a firm handshake and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "So," she said, her gaze sweeping over me like she was evaluating every flaw, "this is the girl who's stolen my son's attention." Her tone was teasing, but there was something sharp beneath it, something that made my stomach tighten. Still, I smiled and laughed it off, telling myself that it was just the natural protectiveness of a mother meeting her son's new girlfriend. But as the weeks turned into months, Margaret's protectiveness began to feel more like possession. Margaret had no concept of personal space, physical or emotional. She called Luke multiple times a day, often during our dates, to ask him about the most trivial things. What was he having for dinner? Did he remember to water his plants? Could he come over and fix her Wi-Fi? At first I tried to see it as sweet. She's just close to her son, I told myself. There's nothing wrong with that, but her behavior quickly escalated. She started showing up unannounced at Luke's apartment, armed with bags of groceries and unsolicited advice about everything from his choice of laundry detergent to the way he arranged his furniture. "This couch would look so much better by the window," she said during one visit, dragging it across the room before either of us could stop her. Luke just chuckled, clearly used to her overstepping. "That's Mom for you," he said with a shrug, but I wasn't used to it. And as Margaret became more involved in our lives, I started to feel like a guest in my own relationship. When Luke proposed to me, it was one of the happiest moments of my life. He took me to the spot where we'd had our first real date, a quiet little park with a view of the city skyline, and got down on one knee. "Emma," he said, his voice shaking with nerves, "you make me happier than I ever thought I could be. Will you marry me?" Through my tears, I said yes, and we spent the rest of the evening dreaming about our future together, but the euphoria didn't last long. The moment Margaret found out about our engagement, she inserted herself into every aspect of the wedding planning. "You'll need to invite the Hendersons," she said, referring to neighbors Luke hadn't spoken to in years. "And I know a fantastic florist. You'll thank me later." I tried to set boundaries. "Thanks, Margaret, but I'd like to handle the planning myself," I said one afternoon. She waved me off, as if I were a child who didn't know what was best. "Oh, don't be silly, weddings are stressful. You'll need all the help you can get." Her help quickly turned into control. She overrode my choice of venue, dismissed my ideas for the menu, and even tried to change my dress. "You're really going with that style," she said during a fitting, her tone dripping with disapproval. "It's just so revealing." I felt humiliated, but Luke tried to smooth things over. "She's just excited," he said, as if that excused everything. Margaret's interference didn't stop at the wedding. Once Luke and I were married, she began crossing boundaries I hadn't even imagined. One day, while helping us unpack after a move, she opened a drawer filled with my lingerie. Instead of closing it and pretending she hadn't seen, she commented, "Well, someone's trying to keep things spicy," she said with a smirk. I froze, mortified. "That's private," I managed to say, my cheeks burning. Margaret shrugged, completely unfazed. "I'm just saying, a little effort goes a long way in a marriage." Her audacity left me speechless. And it only got worse from there. Margaret began dropping hints about grandchildren, despite knowing Luke and I weren't ready for kids yet. "You don't want to wait too long," she'd say during every family dinner. "Your biological clock won't stop for anyone." Her invasiveness extended to the most personal aspects of our relationship. She'd ask Luke if we were keeping the romance alive, and make veiled comments about our sex life, as if it were her business. The final straw came during a family gathering. Margaret had invited Luke's siblings and their families over for a barbecue, and everything was going fine, until she made a toast. "To Luke and Emma," she said, raising her glass. "May they have a long, happy marriage and start working on giving me some grandbabies soon." The room erupted in laughter, but I felt humiliated. Luke tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't let it go. Later that night, I confronted him. "Your mom is out of control, Luke," I said, my voice trembling. "She has no respect for our boundaries." "She doesn't mean any harm," he said defensively. "That's not the point," I replied. "This is our life, not hers. If you don't stand up to her, I don't know how we're going to make this work." For the first time, Luke looked truly worried. After that disastrous barbecue toast, my relationship with Margaret shifted from uncomfortable to unbearable. She didn't just invade my life, she loomed over it like a shadow, always watching, always judging. But what stung the most was Luke's inability, or unwillingness, to set boundaries with her. In the days following our argument, Luke grew distant. He wasn't outright cold, but there was a tension between us that hadn't been there before. Every time I brought up Margaret, he'd get defensive, as if my frustration with her was a personal attack on him. "She's my mom, Emma," he'd say, exasperated. "I can't just cut her out of my life." "I'm not asking you to cut her out," I replied, my voice trembling. "I'm asking you to put us first, to stand up for our marriage." But the more I pushed, the more he pulled away. And Margaret, sensing the cracks in our relationship, wasted no time driving the wedge deeper. Margaret's meddling became more subtle, but no less invasive. She started framing her interference as concern, painting herself as the loving, selfless mother, just trying to help her naive daughter-in-law navigate married life. One afternoon, she showed up at our house uninvited, again. This time, she brought a stack of books with titles like The Proper Wife and Secrets to a Happy Marriage. "I thought these might be helpful," she said with a sugary smile, placing them on the kitchen counter. "Marriage is hard work, after all." I wanted to scream, but instead I plastered on a polite smile and said, "Thank you, Margaret, I'll take a look. Oh, and one more thing," she added, almost as an afterthought. "You might want to reconsider that new recipe you've been trying. Luke mentioned it didn't turn out quite right last time." It felt like a slap in the face. I prided myself on my cooking, and Luke had never complained about it, at least not to me. But here was Margaret, implying that I wasn't even capable of feeding my own husband by this point. I was at my breaking point. I felt like I was fighting two battles, one with Margaret and one with Luke. No matter how many times I tried to explain how her behavior was affecting me, Luke refused to see the problem. "She's just trying to help," he'd say, over and over, like a broken record. It wasn't until one particularly heated argument that I finally snapped. "Luke, if you don't stand up to her, I'm going to therapy, alone if I have to," I said, tears streaming down my face. "Because I can't keep living like this." My words seemed to jolt him awake. For the first time, he didn't argue or make excuses. Instead, he nodded, his expression a mix of guilt and resignation. "Okay," he said quietly. "Let's try therapy." I didn't know whether to feel relieved or apprehensive. Our first session was awkward, to say the least. Luke and I sat on opposite ends of the couch, both of us too afraid to break the silence. Our therapist, Dr. Carter, started by asking us to describe the main issue in our marriage. "It's her mom," I said immediately, my voice trembling with frustration. "She's controlling, invasive, and completely dismissive of my boundaries, and Luke lets her." Luke flinched at my words but didn't interrupt Dr. Carter turned to him. "Luke, how do you feel about what Emma just said?" He hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, I guess I just don't see it the same way. My mom isn't trying to hurt anyone. She's just involved. That's how she's always been." "And how does that make Emma feel?" Dr. Carter asked gently. Luke glanced at me, his eyes filled with uncertainty. I don't know." Hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. After everything we'd been through, how could he still not understand how much this was hurting me? As the sessions continued, Luke started to open up. He admitted that he'd grown up in an environment where Margaret's control was normalized. "She's always been like this," he said during one session. "She micromanaged everything. What I wore, who I hung out with, even what I studied in college. I guess I just got used to it." Hearing him say that broke my heart. For the first time, I saw Margaret's behavior for what it really was, not just a threat to our marriage, but a lifelong pattern of manipulation that Luke had been conditioned to accept. But recognizing the problem was only the first step. Changing it would be much harder. When Luke finally confronted Margaret, it didn't go well. We rehearsed what he would say in therapy, but nothing could have prepared us for her reaction. "Mom," he began cautiously during one of her unannounced visits, "we need to talk about some boundaries." Margaret froze, her eyes narrowing. "Boundaries," she repeated, as if the word were foreign to her. "Yes," Luke said, his voice trembling. "Emma and I feel like you've been a little too involved in our lives. We need some space to figure things out on our own." Margaret's face turned red. "Too involved?" she snapped. "I'm your mother, Luke. I raised you, I've sacrificed everything for you, and now you're telling me I'm too involved." "I'm not saying we don't appreciate you," Luke said quickly. "But we need to set some limits." Margaret's voice grew louder with every word. "Limits? So this is Emma's doing, isn't it? She's poisoning you against me." I stood there, stunned, as Margaret's meltdown escalated. She accused me of tearing the family apart, of manipulating Luke, of being an ungrateful, selfish daughter-in-law. "I've always put this family first," she shouted, tears streaming down her face. "And this is the thanks I get." After Margaret stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Luke and I sat in silence. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumped and his head in his hands. "I didn't think it would be that bad," he said quietly. I placed a hand on his shoulder, unsure of what to say. I wanted to comfort him, but part of me was still angry, at Margaret, at him, at the situation we'd found ourselves in. That night, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying Margaret's words in my head. Was I tearing the family apart? Was I being selfish? But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about me. This was about a woman who had spent her entire life controlling the people around her, and a man who was finally starting to break free from her grip. Please, I say to you, sorry. Please wait for next updates. I hope you really like this story part.